Are Africans proud of who they are? What influence has colonialism had on African nationalism and unity? Is regional economic integration in Africa realistically possible? Does the African Union have the capacity to address Africa's socio-economic challenges? What time is it? It's question time. Hello and welcome to the show. My name is Bongi Kwala. Standing in from Port Said today, the effects of the colonization of Africa continue to affect the continent. African nations had to undergo various forms of divisions, one of which was the creation of borders with the sole purpose of dividing and ruling these countries. While the African Union replaced the Organization of African Unity in 2002, only minimal progress has been made towards uniting the continent. While regional bodies do exist, African countries are still largely isolated, and this only exacerbates further divisions, with Pan-Africanism and African nationalism only relegated to academic debates and scholarly articles. But is the ideal of a united Africa achievable? Well, my guest today is Professor Herbert Vilakazi, an independent scholar, just to talk us through. Prof, welcome.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Let's start by saying, as Africans, are we proud to be who we are, to be Africans?
Not quite proud, sufficiently proud, we are, because of the terrible, unspeakable, and horrible oppression that Africa, suffered. And the process of repairing not just Africa physically, but also psychological repair of Africans and mental repair of Africans is still a process that is just going on. So we are not yet sufficiently proud and independent to be able to take definite steps to correct our situation and move forward.
Why is that? Why is it taking so long for Africans to be proud of being Africans? I mean, there are countries that have been liberated for over 50, 60 years right now. Are they not proud of who they are? Or what does it take to be proud of being an African?
Well, first of all, you must be independent. Colonialism destroyed the independent states of Africa. You see? There were kingdoms that were independent, and you can't until you are really independent, and then you're in a position to make decisions, about your own development yourself. You can't really get out of the quagmire, that we're in. So African countries are not yet independent. They haven't been independent for a long time. They are not yet independent in the sense that the African economies are not controlled by Africans.
It's a very interesting point that you're raising right now, but I want to start by asking, because if you go across Africa, you'll find that the leaders of African countries are Africans themselves. Why are they not liberating themselves and, by extension, liberating their countries and, by and large, liberating Africa then?
You must keep in mind that we live in a world right now. The world power politics, there are, economic power groups, in the world. And there are some powers that are not interested, in helping Africa to really develop and become an independent, a series of independent countries. So that hostility is very, very, important. To develop today effectively, you need monies, but who is controlling monies? But today it's largely Western countries. What I am proposing, what a lot of people have actually proposed, is that the resources of Africa are so enormous. Africa has just about everything that the world needs. You see, yet Africa is poor. What we need to do is to bring about an economic union, at least we can begin with Southern African countries.
The issue of minerals, I was going to touch on that. Now that we're talking about that, do you think economic freedom will emancipate us as Africans, and then we realize this notion then of being African and being proud of that? So do we need to be economically free first before we can call ourselves African? I mean, I'm trying to understand that point, Prof.
Economic freedom, when you say, you ask about, do we have to be economically free first, that is a process that we must achieve ourselves through development, through development. We're not today developing, we're not developing. What I am suggesting is that we should actually form, a central economic council which is going to make investment and planning policies for the whole of southern Africa. And that way we would have enormous power. The different, if you take BRICS, for example, Russia, China, South Africa and Brazil. Africa alone, has enough resources, Southern Africa, which actually surpass, the nations that today form BRICS. So if we put that together, and we are guided by, wise people who then are going to implement, effective development policies, Africa will then have power, in the world.
All right, perhaps we've skipped a very important a question here, that who deserves to be called an African? Who is an African?
Who is an African? Of course, it's an old question, but it used to be...
But there are different answers to that too.
Well, it was only after Africa was conquered by non-Africans, that the issue became a public issue. Who is an African? There was never a problem, about who an African was. But when there were outsiders, who then conquered Africa and then were, determined that they should also be included now as Africans, we don't mind that. Anybody who lives in Africa can be that, but you must then behave like a real, African. In other words, you must have the interest of Africa first and foremost, in your heart, and cooperate with other Africans.
That's very interesting, because if you come from outside Europe, that does not make you a European. So are you suggesting, therefore, that you can be an outsider coming from outside of Africa and reside here, and then you become an African?
No.
Is it by birth? Is it by origin to be an African?
No. What I'm simply saying is that, Africa, first and foremost, belongs to Africans.
Yes.
It's an African continent, you see. And the indigenous people, have the first right to it. But that does not mean, therefore that you discriminate against other people. I can go to China. There are some non-Chinese people who live in China. They don't call themselves Chinese. They are citizens of China. They are citizens of... It's one thing to be... Citizenship is one thing which gives you all the rights that the Chinese people have. But, there is also the issue of who is an indigenous, Chinese.
All right.
We are saying that, the same with Africa. We don't want to discriminate against, people from outside. They can enjoy citizenship rights, but, even if they behave, in an African way, but we still insist that, there are such people as indigenous Africans.
All right, hold that thought, because you're talking about China right now. I'll remind you later on that there are Chinese now who qualify to be called for black economic empowerment here in South Africa. Let's leave it at that for now, Professor Herbert Vilakazi. Question time is taking a short break. Don't go away.
This week we are taking you around the continent, telling you stories about what makes Africa, Africa.
We now head to the Kenyan coast, where we meet a man using needles to fight a growing drug culture.
A recent study revealed that there are 850 drug addicts in Diani alone, with over 220 using injectable drugs such as heroin.
In my community, I've seen a lot of these people suffer.
The Journal, every Saturday at 1:30 on SABC News.
Welcome back. You're still watching Question Time here on SABC. My guest today is Professor Herbert Vilakazi. Professor, let's continue with this discussion, and I would like for us now to focus on the economy of Africa and who owns the economy of Africa, and what is then the role that is being played by the economy of Africa in integrating us as Africans. Because there is this notion, I mean, right now you are talking about SADC, there is ECOWAS, there is COMESA, all these regional bodies, they further divide us, and they further punctuate the point that we are divided. There are borders in Africa. So let's start with the role that is being played then by the regional economic growth and the regional economy really in defining African.
The existing, regional, groupings are not yet really doing the job that they really should be doing, as far as, developing Africa is concerned, you see. What we should be talking about, you see, when you're talking about unity, economic unity, you're talking about the capacity now, centralized capacity to be able to make investment and planning decisions for economic development. What we are proposing, for example, is that in this economic council that we are proposing, Central Economic Council, will make decisions, for example, for the development of the infrastructure, rails, harbors, roads, airports throughout, Southern Africa. Two, that, they will be responsible for the infrastructure of education, of health, and housing, for example, and then the infrastructure, also the environmental care. But the most important one right now, the most important one and urgently needed one is to initiate an agricultural revolution, for the entire, region.
How possible is that, Professor? Because, you'll find that individually, as countries, we have our own challenges when it comes to infrastructure, for instance, the infrastructure that drives the economy, for instance, the railway lines. You'll find that there are problems. Here in South Africa, we're faced with, a challenge of power. ESCOM is struggling here and there. We have that problem. Other countries that we supply power to have their own problems. So to talk a regional kind of, an approach when individually as countries we are struggling, do you think that is realistic?
It is possible, it is realistic, it is possible. The problems that exist, if you're talking, for example, take the solution of the water problem, the problem of water. South Africa, is working, there is the Lesotho water project, In other words, we're getting a lot of our water from Lesotho. There were decisions, specific decisions that were made, which, created brought about that cooperative act to develop the Lesotho water, project, which will also benefit, South Africa. You need that kind of mindset, which is still lacking, still not there right now, for us to work together, and make decisions. There are enough skilled people, enough educated people, enough people who have learned how development is achieved throughout the world to be able to get these people together and say, and make decisions as to what do you need to make sure that there is a railway that works from South Africa to Tanzania, from South Africa to Cairo, and so on. There are people who can do that. How do you solve the water problem? If you talk about the electricity problem, the present electricity problem of South Africa was a result of bad planning, and therefore the present economic problems of Africa are as a result also of bad planning. Now, why
it talks to leadership?
Why
as well.
Exactly? No. Why now? You had people like Nkrumah, for example, who had a vision and plans for unifying Africa and bring about, a common economic plan for the whole of Africa. What happened to Nkrumah? Nkrumah was overthrown. In other words, there are people, there are powers that are opposed to that. There are powers that were opposed to that, implementation of the program of African nationalism, that we need. You see, if you take Swaziland, Lesotho, Botswana, you see, these countries really were artificially created, including South Africa itself. You see, in the sense that who is a Msotho? The people of Lesotho stretch all the way from Maseru, Lesotho, up to Johannesburg. But the whites came and drew a line arbitrarily and said this belonged to Lesotho, this belonged to South Africa. Who's a Swazi? Swaziland stretches all the way from Swaziland, the Swazi stretch from Swaziland up to Johannesburg. But some people came and arbitrarily drew that line to say that this belonged to Sobuza, this belonged to South Africa.
You talk about then colonialism, but you touched on something very important, the Pan-Africanism. Really, can we go back to that and
Yes.
African nationalism? Really,
Yes.
can we go back to that and achieve it at this day and age, or really we are driven by capital? And we're looking forward to being rich, and the rich getting more richer, and the poor getting more poor.
Well, we'll be forced by circumstances to do that. You see, when there is, there are decisions that that are forced upon people, by these circumstances. For example, when Hitler attacked England. The English were forced to make certain decisions, to repel that and to deal with that problem. I'm saying that the continuing underdevelopment of Africa and the continuing poverty and misery and diseases that are going on, and sooner or later that is going to result also in upheavals, in upheavals.
All right.
Sooner or later, some people must arise who will say that, look, we've tried this path, it's not working, let us try this direction now.
All right. Can we dismantle colonial era borders? For instance, Muammar Gaddafi, the late Muammar Gaddafi, was talking of one Africa, even one currency, and break down all these borders so that it's one Africa. Is that possible?
The United States did it. There used to be different states, but now you have got a United States of America. Europe is in the process of doing it. You see, there were many different, European countries. At first they were the European Common Market. Now you have got, the European Union, and they are in the process, of doing that. There are, problems here and there, but the process is going on. Why can't we do it? Why can't we do it? It's a question of that seriousness, you see, and also the ability. We have to awaken African people so that they demand the right kind of leadership. Right kind of leadership that is not bribed, by international capital, that is not corrupted, by international, capital. A leadership that will work for the development of Africa.
All right. When we come back, Professor Vilakazi, I want us to talk about, Africans turning on Africans. We see it happening in our townships here right now. So I want to solicit your view on that. Question time takes a break. Don't go away. Welcome back. You are watching Question Time here on SABC. My guest today is Professor Herbert Vilakazi. He is an independent scholar, and really we're talking Africanism. Professor, in the past few days, still happening, even today as we speak, you know, the looting of foreign-owned shops here in South Africa, in the main. What do you make of that? And what does that then say to the concept of Ubuntu and the concept of Africanism?
We must look at this, in the world, context. You see, when there is an economic downturn, if you look at Europe, look at America, take Europe. When there is a downturn, economic downturn, meaning, when there is a lot of unemployment, a lot of, factories closing down, you do get a rise of violence and a rise of, xenophobia, Go to Germany, attacks against the Turkish people, non-Germans, go anywhere you find that process. South Africa, in other words, what I'm simply saying is that there's a short-term view, of this, then the long-term view. The short-term view is that, of course, when this occurs, the steps must be taken to stop it and to bring about, better education, of our people and to protect, life and properties of everybody. But the long-term view, very, very serious one, is to put in place development policies that work so that you reduce unemployment or eliminate unemployment, and you reduce poverty, you reduce squalor, in the world. When the rate of poverty, goes up, then you're going to have a rise of incidents of attacks. You begin by attacking people who don't look like you. Whites used to do that against Africans, against black people, and even among themselves. Whites are still doing it in Europe. The Finns, the Greeks, and so on and so on. It's still going on. So what I'm saying is that we must link this to the economic, conditions of the society.
But I'm just looking at the role that for instance, a government should have played here a long time ago. I'm talking about, let me focus on the townships, for instance. There were shops that were destroyed during violence, back in the 80s, 90s. And the shop owners were unable to revive those shops. But today, and those shops were lying idle there. But today, those shops are owned by foreign nationals, and they are active. Local people are unable to utilize those shops. So I'm saying, how do you then balance the two and say, look, let's get this shop back to work so that you get a little bit of money, whether it's rent or, but also make sure that you balance it so that people don't look at it as the local administration is supporting foreign nationals at our expense.
What is lacking, in South Africa is a correct development policy. Correct development policy, and therefore correct planning, realistic correct planning to solve our economic, problems. Whether you're talking about the township or you're talking about rural areas, or any part, of the country. We don't have that, you see, we don't have that. And as long as that is missing, we are going to have we're always going to be putting out fires. Always going to be putting out fires.
But why are we not putting out fires when it comes to the likes of the Chinese people on the continent, for instance? Why is this trade so skewed such that, China is in Africa? Well and good. But, it's very difficult for Africans to go to China and start businesses and run successful businesses. As we see, there's even China City across Africa.
Why are Chinese all over the world? Because China has developed. Why has China developed? Because of certain policies, development policies that were adopted by the leadership of China. And I'm saying that if we in Africa, do similarly, we have correct development policies, then we'll be in a better position to deal with these problems. As long as Africa is not developing, but the other, the China and the others are developing, they are going to be coming to Africa, of course, and Africa is just going to be, looted by other countries.
Exactly my point, because I'm not suggesting that that should happen, but I'm saying what is happening is that in the townships, for instance, there are Chinese shops, but they're not being attacked. Why and we are talking Africanism here. Why are Africans in our townships turning against other Africans from Somalia, from Kenya, who are trying to make a living in the townships? Yeah,
but I've mentioned that, when there is a downturn and things are bad, and there's that irrational phase in people in our history, in our life, and the first people that you attack are people who look like you but who are not you see, and who look like, and then that's where now government can come in. Government can come in with better policies and better educational programs to be able to deal with that problem.
All right. And the United States of Africa, importantly, but of Southern Africa as well, will that work? Do you think that can be implemented?
Only you and me and others, here and others in Africa should make decisions to implement that.
But is it a possibility?
It is a possibility.
Who should try?
If we want to. Well, what is it that made United States of America a possibility? It's the people themselves who made that decision. What has made the European Union a possibility is the Europeans themselves who have done that. You see, what has made the Chinese a power? It's the Chinese, the decisions by the Chinese. What I'm simply saying is that we as Africans have to be determined enough and educate ourselves properly, enough, learn from the other experiences of the world, and then say, we have got so many resources in this country, we must manage them better, so that, the country, develops, Africa develops. We're not at that point yet.
All right. Let's leave it at that point. Thank you very much, Professor Herbert Vilakazi. And that was Question Time for today. A big thank you to our guest and to you for watching the program. We welcome your feedback via email on questiontime@sabc.co.za, or you can tweet us. Our Twitter handle is @questiontime24. From me and the rest of the crew, have yourself a wonderful time. Goodbye.